Isn't it true that our greatest regrets stem from the fact that we knew the difference between right and wrong and we chose what was wrong? Isn't it true the thing that we drag around that we wish we could erase from our mind and erase from our lives were those decisions that were the wrong decisions? And Jesus says, look, I know it may not be popular. I know it may sound religious, but happy are those who hunger, I love this, hunger and thirst for righteousness, for ultimately they will be filled. And then he goes on, he's not done. He says this, he says, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. What's mercy? He's essentially saying this. I love this. Happy are the relationally generous. Happy are the relationally generous. Happy are those that give people exactly what they don't deserve relationally. Happy are those who aren't seeking revenge. Happy are those who forgive. Happy are those who don't hold grudges. Happy are those who put away bitterness. Happy are those who are not waiting to be paid back from someone in their past. Because you know this. You've never met a happy, bitter person. You've never met a happy person who holds a grudge. You've never met a happy person who's waiting to be paid back from some previous relationship. But what you have met are people who've been extraordinarily mistreated. You've met people who've gone through circumstances you wouldn't wish on your enemy. And somehow they've emerged on the other side and they're fine, they're happy. And when you scratch beneath the surface, what you discover is this. These are men and women who understand what it means to be relationally generous. They decided to extend to their father exactly what their father didn't deserve. They decided to extend to that boss exactly what that boss didn't deserve. They decided to extend to that ex-husband or that ex-wife exactly what that ex-husband or wife didn't deserve. They were relationally generous. And even though they were never paid back, even though they never extracted revenge, even though they never got an apology, even though the person that offended them never owned up fully to what they did, they are happy. And Jesus says, I understand this. Happy, blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Isn't that brilliant? I mean, isn't it somewhat intuitive? But isn't it something that we quickly forget? And then he goes on and he gets to my favorite one. And I think this is my favorite one because I think it's the one that doesn't get enough attention. It's sensitive. Anytime I try to talk about this in church or one-on-one with somebody, I feel like sometimes I cross a line and I offend people. And yet in this next statement, I think it's so big that if Jesus had just come to earth and said this one thing and died for our sins, it's enough for us to go on for a long, long time. Because in this next statement, Jesus essentially baits us in. He says, would you like to see God? Or would you like to see so clearly in life that you would recognize where God is at work in the world? Would you like to be able to recognize God's plan for your life? Would you like to recognize what God wants you to do in tough decisions, whether it has to do with relationships or money or your future or your career? Would you like to see clearly? Would you like to be able to see as clear as anyone can possibly see? Would you like to be able to look at circumstances and invitations and opportunities and see what leads to trouble and what leads you to a place where you will be able to avoid regret? Would you like to have that kind of clarity in life, to which all of us would say yes? And Jesus leans into his crowd and he leans into us. And he makes this incredible, incredible statement. He says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. I just think that's one of the most profound things in the entire New Testament, perhaps the entire scriptures. And I'll tell you why. Part of it is because of my experience as a pastor. Because I have talked to countless people who have said, and perhaps all of us to some extent would say this ourselves, people who would look back on their past, a previous relationship, a previous season in life, and they would say, Andy, I just don't know how I allowed myself to get in that. Why didn't I see it coming? How could I have been so stupid? How could I have been so naive? Why didn't I see it coming? Why didn't I, to use our word, why didn't I have the clarity I needed to stay out, to say no, to get up and leave, to walk away, to just stay away? What was going on? And as gently as I know how, I see, Jesus addressed this. Jesus has invited us to purity. In a culture that doesn't even use the word except when it talks about water. But other than water, the idea of purity and the idea of moral purity is so, not in vogue, is not something anyone talks about. But Jesus says, I just want you to know, the clarity that you need for life is found in purity, moral purity, ethical purity, the decision to purify your mind, to look above and beyond, to decide, I don't have to experience everything in life to understand life. In fact, Jesus will say it's the opposite. If you would like to have clarity about life, if you want to have clarity about sin, stay away because purity leads to clarity. He says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they have the greatest chance of identifying and seeing the activity of God. See, for some of you right now, this is a real issue because you're trying to make a decision relationally, morally, ethically. And there's something in you that says, I'm missing out, I'm missing out, I'm missing out, I'm missing out. And Jesus would say to you, no. And if you will purify your mind, and if you will renew your mind, and if you will think my thoughts, the day will come when you will realize you weren't missing out. You'll have the clarity to see that following me leads to happiness. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And let's face it, in our culture, this is difficult. No one's calling us to this. No one is reminding us of this. And so Jesus drops it in there, just a simple statement that was true then, and it's true today. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. That is a big idea. And he keeps going. He says this, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Why? Because your heavenly Father wants to make peace with you. And when you make peace with other people, you're acting like your Father in heaven. So he says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Now, let me just turn it around and ask you this question. Do you know any happy troublemakers? I mean, when you think about the person that's always stirring it up in the office, always stirring it up in school, always stirring it up in the fraternity or sorority, they're just always making trouble. Do you consider these happy people? Do you know any happy troublemakers, the opposite of a peacemaker? Of course not, because troublemakers are troubled by other people's happiness. Troublemakers are troubled by happy people. They really are. Troublemakers like to target happy people, because troublemakers want everybody to be unhappy. It's just the nature of troublemakers. Years ago, I had the opportunity to interview Joyce Myers and her husband, Dave. And in this interview, Joyce talked about the fact that early on in their marriage, she was so extraordinarily unhappy, and it drove her crazy because her husband, Dave, was so happy. She said, so I decided, if I'm not happy, he's not gonna be happy. And she said, I just did my best to make him unhappy because I was so unhappy. This is what unhappy people do. They become troublemakers. And she said, finally, Dave looked at me one day and said, Joyce, I'm going to be happy whether you're happy or not. And she said this was a turning point for her in her own thinking, in her own mind, especially as it related to her faith. And Jesus says, look, there's no happiness found in troublemaking. There's happiness found in peacemaking. Here's my way of saying it. Happy are the reconcilers. Happy are the people that are willing to walk into relationships that are broken or breaking, and those who make peace. Happy are the peacemakers. Happy are the reconcilers. Now, isn't that just true? I mean, when you think of happy people, aren't they reconcilers rather than troublemakers? How did Jesus know this? How did 2,000 years ago, why was he able to do such an extraordinary job dissecting happiness and inviting us into it? This is why whether you're a Christian or not, whether you take Jesus seriously or not, whether you believe he's the Son of God or not, you should read the words of Jesus, because Jesus was constantly inviting people who did not believe he was the Son of God to follow him anyway. And then he gets to the one that's like, okay, mercy, I got the, you blessed are the merciful, I can kind of go with, and the pure in heart, not sure I'm gonna do that, but it kind of makes sense because I look back at my life and I should have seen it coming, and now I can see it, and I wonder why I get that. But this next one is where we both put both feet on the brake. It's like, I just can't go there with Jesus. But I'm telling you, this may be the most brilliant one of all. Here's what Jesus said to wrap it up. He said, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. To which we say, okay, see, this word and happiness, they do not go together. This word and blessed don't go together. If I'm being persecuted, if I lost my job, for doing the right thing, or I, failed a test because everybody else had the notes and I didn't get the notes and I didn't want to cheat and I failed the test and then my GPA goes down. I mean, there's no I'm blessed based on being persecuted. But here's what Jesus was getting at, and here's what becomes clear throughout the entire New Testament, and here's what we will all discover eventually in life. So let me go ahead and say it for you in case you haven't gotten there yet, and it's simply this. You are going to suffer in this life for doing right or for doing wrong. In this life, in your life, you are going to suffer for either doing the right thing or you're going to suffer for doing the wrong thing. But you can only be happy on one side of that equation. You can't be happy on the other. You can be happy when you're persecuted for doing the right thing, because at the end of the day, you have peace with you and you have peace with God. But if you suffer for doing the wrong thing, you don't have peace with you and you don't have peace with God. And Jesus draws us into this broader context of saying, to just think about it. In your life, but you are going to be persecuted. You are going to be mistreated. Do you want to be mistreated for doing the right thing? Or do you want to be mistreated for doing the wrong thing? Blessed are those, happy are those, who, when it comes down to it, choose to pursue righteousness even when it costs them. Because you can be happy doing the right thing and facing the consequences. You cannot be happy doing the wrong thing and ultimately facing the consequences for a decision you should have never made. It's just absolutely brilliant. Because when you're persecuted, when you're mistreated, when there is a consequence for doing the right thing, you can maintain your peace with God and you can maintain your peace with you. Isn't that, it's like, yeah, I mean, why didn't I see that? I've read that 1,000 times. Maybe you learned a song. Maybe you've heard somebody teach through this. Jesus says, this is how you live a blessed life. This is what it means to be happy. These are the activities. These are the mindset. This is how you achieve happiness. But here's the question, as I said at the beginning. The question for us today, because there's so much detail, there's so much more we could say. What's the common denominator? In other words, when Jesus finishes this part of the message, because he moves on to some other stuff, what is the takeaway from all that detail, all those applications, and all those words? And the takeaway, the big aha moment, the thing that perhaps could be life-changing for some of you as you struggle with this season of your life, is that through all of these words, Jesus brings us to this unavoidable conclusion that happiness is an outcome. Happiness is a result. Happiness is about something now that leads to something later. Happiness is more about ultimate than immediate. That happiness is not immediately accessible. In other words, that means you can't hear a song, you can't read a book, you can't even hear a message like this and walk out and say, you know what? I was unhappy at 12:30, but at 12:35, I'm happy. I'm happy now. I did it. I heard that thing. I read that thing. I prayed that prayer. I went to the deal. I went to the conference. I took notes. He says, no, you need to understand. Happiness is better than that. It's richer than that. It's deeper than that. Happiness is an outcome. Happiness is more farmer than programmer. You know what I mean? In other words, you sow and you reap your way to happy. Just as some of you, if you were honest, would say, and I have sown and reaped my way into unhappiness. The place that you are, the place you wish you could avoid, the place that you wish you never arrived, you sowed your way there. And Jesus says, I have some great news. You can sow your way out, and you can sow your way to a blessed life. You can decide now to embrace meekness. You can decide now to be relationally generous and to become a merciful person. You can decide now that from now on, I'm not going to be a divider. I'm going to be a peacemaker, not a troublemaker. You can decide by God's grace from now on, even if it costs me, I want to be a person who hungers and thirsts for righteousness. I want to commit to doing the right thing. I'm going to become a reconciler, not a divider. And by God's grace, even if it means I got to get new roommates, even if it means I need to move, even if it means I need to cancel some subscriptions, I am going to pursue purity because I want to see God. Happiness is an outcome. It's a result. You sow and you reap your way there. This is why at the end of this incredible sermon, his most famous sermon, at the end of the sermon, Jesus gives us a little parable. In fact, if you grew up in church, you've heard this so many times before. In fact, if you grew up in the kind of church I did, you know a song about it. We won't break into song. At the end of this message, okay, because Jesus has covered so many things, so many different areas of life, even beyond what we've talked about. At the very end of the message, here's how he concludes this powerful, powerful teaching. He says this. He says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine, and they all heard, and puts them into practice. Not goes, oh, that was really good, I wrote that down. Not says, my mom really needs to hear this. Not who says, oh, that was convicting, or says, oh, I've never heard anything like that before. He says, anybody who hears what I just said and not just agrees with it, but puts it into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock, and this took some time. A brand new house built by a builder is not immediately accessible. It takes a while. And Jesus says the person who hears what I just said and decides from this day forward, from this point on, he says is like a person that began the process of building a house on solid rock. Nothing changed immediately, but something changed eventually. But then he says this, remember the flip side? But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice, even if you agreed, even if you thought it was interesting, even if you knew somebody else who needed to hear this. He said, anyone who hears these words of mine and just walks away and doesn't put them into practice, you get no credit for hearing. You get no credit for listening. In our vernacular, you get no credit for being in church. And I know we love to call our parents and say, guess where I was today? I went to church, woohoo. God saw me there, I told my mom there, click. Jesus says, you're deceiving yourself. There is no benefit in hearing. There is no benefit in listening. There is only benefit in doing. Doing is what makes all the difference. And Jesus says, anyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand, which took some time. There was no immediate return. There was no immediate consequence or outcome. But you know the rest of the parable. And eventually there was a storm. And at the end of the storm, the man whose house was built on the rock, his house was standing. The man who built his house on the sand had nothing but regret, nothing to show for it. Happiness, please don't ever forget this. Happiness is an outcome. Happiness is a result.